The training hall hummed with the usual buzz of activity as cadets prepared for their evening drills. Cool air flowed through the vents while holographic targets blinked in time with the rhythm of the exercises. The sharp sounds of gloves striking practice drones echoed across the vast space. In one corner, a young cadet named Finn, only 14 years old, tightened the straps on his wrist guards. He was smaller than the others, lean and quick, but he stood quietly, focusing on the instructor's every move. Unlike the others, Finn wasn't loud or boastful. He was all concentration, just watching, learning, and putting everything into his practice. The instructor, a large and imposing figure named Torek, walked the mats with confidence. Torek, a towering figure with his dusky red skin and jagged ridges along his skull, commanded the room effortlessly. His hands, massive and four-fingered, made sharp gestures as he barked out commands, pausing only briefly for a break. As the cadets gathered to hydrate, an older student, a tall and gangly individual from the nearby sector, nudged Finn playfully. "So, what made you get into combat training?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You don't exactly look like the fighting type." Finn hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice steady, yet proud. "My grandfather trained the Emperor's personal guard. He taught me the basics." The room quieted for an instant before erupting into laughter. "Your grandfather?" one cadet mocked. A tall being with pale blue skin and several antennae, he sneered. Was he some kind of ancient warrior from the old legends? Torek, who had been overseeing the conversation, caught wind of the exchange and strode over, an amused glint in his eyes. "Really? Your grandfather trained the Emperor's guard," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Finn stood straight, his eyes never leaving the mat. "Yes, sir. He served aboard the Emperor's flagship, the Aurelia, during the Lunar Wars," Finn explained, keeping his voice calm but firm. "He doesn't talk about it much, but—" Torek cut him off with a booming laugh, slapping his hand on his own forearm. "The Emperor's Guard, huh? Are we in a training hall or a hollow movie studio?" he said, his voice loud and dismissive. The cadets erupted into laughter once again, emboldened by the instructor's mockery. One cadet even imitated a salute from the Imperial Guard, while another mimicked the sound of explosions. Finn stood still, his hands clenched by his sides, not a word leaving his lips. He didn't defend himself, nor did he turn away. His gaze remained fixed, unblinking. Torek stepped closer, his voice low, as if relishing the moment. "You want to earn respect here, boy? You don't do it with fake stories. You earn it with real work." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," Finn replied quietly, his tone firm but controlled. Torek's smile vanished in an instant. "Then let's see if you can handle a little lesson in humility." Before Finn could react, Torek's hand shot out, striking him across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the hall, silencing the room instantly. Finn staggered but didn't fall, his hand instinctively rising to his cheek, the burn of the blow lingering. He didn't cry, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, head lowered, eyes focused on the floor. The other cadets shifted uneasily. One murmured something under their breath, but Torek was already turning away, barking orders for the session to continue. Enough of this nonsense. Back to work. Finn moved to the corner of the hall, hands tightening on his gloves. He didn't join the others for sparring, though the sting on his cheek was fresh. Instead, he stood by himself, steeling his resolve. The pride in his chest hurt more than the physical wound. No one spoke to him again for the rest of the session. When the session ended, the cadets filed out, joking and laughing as if nothing had happened. Finn silently packed his gear, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the floor, his thoughts lost in the quiet hum of the hall. As he left the training room, the station's artificial day cycle had already started to dim, casting long shadows along the hallways. He walked home alone, the rhythmic sound of his boots the only noise in the otherwise quiet corridors. The sharp sting of the slap still lingered, but it was his pride that felt bruised more than his skin. Taking a detour, Finn passed through the maintenance tunnels, allowing the cool air to calm his nerves. By the time he reached the residential quarters, the lights had switched to evening mode, bathing everything in a soft, warm glow. In the small community garden outside their living space, Finn's grandfather, an older man with graying hair and a weathered mechanic's jumpsuit, knelt among the plants, gently tending to the rows of tomatoes. He didn't smile when Finn approached, but his presence alone seemed to steady the air around him. The older man didn't ask any questions, he simply gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Training ended early, his grandfather, known as Mal, asked as Finn walked past. It didn't, Finn answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mal stood, his movements slow but purposeful. He didn't wear any kind of rank or insignia, but there was a gravity to his posture that made the space around him feel heavier. He glanced at his grandson's face, taking in the faint red mark on Finn's cheek. He didn't ask what happened, instead, he opened the door to their quarters and held it for Finn. "Wash up. Dinner's almost ready." Inside, Finn set his bag down quietly, moving toward the sink. Mal followed behind and paused near a wooden cabinet. He retrieved a small object from the shelf, an old, tarnished medallion, an imperial commendation from Finn's grandfather's time. The metal still shimmered at the edges, despite the years of use. Mal placed it on the table without a word. Finn glanced at it, then up at his grandfather. "You remember what this is?" Mal asked, his voice calm, his eyes steady. Finn nodded slowly. "You said they only gave it to those who completed the elite guard combat program. Back when you trained them." Mal placed both hands on the table, leaning in slightly. "You keep this to yourself. No one needs to know who you are until the moment they do." Finn nodded in understanding. He glanced at the medallion again, the soft light of the kitchen catching its edges, before returning his gaze to his grandfather's face. Mal's voice was firm. "Finish your dinner. We've got an early start tomorrow." The next morning, Finn sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched breakfast. The imprint on his cheek had faded a little, but it was still there, a mark on both his skin and his spirit. Across from him, Mal sipped his coffee in silence. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the station's systems. Finally, Mal set his cup down and stood. "Put your boots on. We're leaving in 15 minutes. Finn looked up, confusion on his face. "Where are we going?" Mal didn't answer. He simply walked to his room, shutting the door behind him. 15 minutes later, Finn stood by the door, his training bag slung over his shoulder. He wore the same combat shirt from the day before, the collar tugged nervously. When Mal emerged, he wore plain utility pants and a neutral shirt, his weathered cap in place. No fanfare. No explanation. They boarded the transport shuttle in silence, the soft hum of the electric engines the only sound. The ride was calm, and Finn tried to steal glances at his grandfather, searching for any clue as to what was happening, but Mal's expression remained unreadable. The air in the training room felt different now. It wasn't the usual noise or light-hearted mockery that filled the space. There was a heaviness to it, a deep, almost foreboding silence. The tension was palpable, something was coming, but it wasn't violence. It was the quiet before truth would hit like a storm. After a long, unspoken moment, Malcolm and Finn stepped off the moving walkway, arriving at the combat training center. Finn hesitated, looking up at his grandfather. "I don't have any classes today," he said, almost as if trying to justify being there. Malcolm simply nodded, his face unreadable. "I know," he replied, his tone measured and calm. Finn waited for more, but his grandfather offered nothing further. Inside the training center, the atmosphere was starkly different from the day before. A few cadets were in the back, sparring with low energy, barely breaking a sweat. Instructor Torek stood near the center, arms crossed, observing the pair with a disinterested gaze. He glanced up as they entered, and his voice cut through the room. "Look who's back," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Didn't get enough of a lesson yesterday, huh?" A few cadets looked over, smirking, but most continued with their training, unaffected. Torek's eyes moved toward Malcolm, narrowing as he tried to size him up. "Is this your lawyer, or has your legendary grandfather come to tell his bedtime stories in person?" Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't speak, merely walked to the edge of the mats and stood, hands casually resting in his pockets. Finn stood beside him, unsure of the next step. Torek tilted his head, a grin tugging at his lips. "You here to file a complaint or just watch?" I'm just here to observe, Malcolm replied calmly. But if you're done running your mouth, I might have a few thoughts to share later. His words hung in the air, soft but cutting, as though they had sliced right through the noise of the training floor. A few cadets, momentarily distracted, paused to glance around, feeling the change in the room. Torek didn't like it. Listen, old man, Torek scoffed, stepping closer. This is my training hall. I don't need life lessons from someone who probably got their combat cert from a cereal packet. Malcolm took in the familiar surroundings, the scuffed mats, the ever-present scent of sweat, and the drive of the cadets pushing themselves. I've seen a lot of training halls, he said softly. Some build fighters. Others just build noise. Torek sneered. You got something to say, then say it. Malcolm turned to Finn. Stretch out. Warm up. His voice was quiet but firm. Finn blinked, surprised by the command, but he nodded and began to move toward the far side of the mat, his grandfather's voice still resonating in his mind. He went through the same warm-up routine he'd been taught, the same stretches they had practiced in the quiet of the hydroponics gardens. It was muscle memory now, but today, the stretches carried more weight. There was a purpose behind them. Torek watched for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to Malcolm. What exactly are you trying to prove here? Malcolm tilted his head slightly. I'm not trying to prove anything. That's your thing. Torek's jaw tightened. You think you're better than me? You think I don't know what I'm doing? Malcolm's voice remained level, but his eyes sharpened. I think you hit a kid for telling the truth, then bragged about it. A tense silence spread across the room. Some cadets looked at each other, unsure of whether to intervene. Torek raised his hands, trying to regain control. You want to talk big? Torek sneered. Fine. Step on the mat. Let's see what you've got. Malcolm took a long look around the room. For a moment, it seemed like he might accept the challenge. But instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, weathered patch. The faded insignia of the Imperial Elite Guard was stitched into it, along with a set of initials, worn with age. He held it up for all to see, his voice barely above a whisper. This used to mean something, Malcolm said softly. It still does. But it's not about what's mine. It's about the one your student was trying to honor yesterday. Torek paused, caught off guard. The cadets froze, eyes widening as they recognized the insignia. This wasn't just a relic, it was real. It was history, something that came alive in the presence of Malcolm Reynolds. Malcolm turned to Finn. We'll talk again after you train. Go finish what you started. There was no shout, no explanation. Just a quiet command. But for the first time since entering the training center, the room was completely still. No one laughed. No one mocked. Outside the training center, the artificial daylight had dimmed, casting long shadows across the mats. Finn sat quietly, lacing his gloves, his gaze fixed on the floor. The energy of the class had shifted. Some cadets still joked, throwing light punches, but others kept glancing toward the entrance, where Malcolm stood, a quiet but undeniable presence. He hadn't spoken a word since presenting the patch, but his silence was louder than any argument could have been. Instructor Torek paced back and forth at the edge of the mat, trying to maintain control, his voice sharper than usual. All right, reset. Back to basics. Pair up. We've got work to do. But the cadets moved slower now, distracted. Their eyes flicked from Finn to Malcolm, from Torek to the mat, unsure of where to focus. The tension in the air was no longer a joke. It was real. Torek turned and pointed at Finn. You with Tarkin. 5 rounds. Let's go. Finn nodded and stood. He moved with a calm precision, his posture perfect. Tarkin, larger and older, with skin the color of a distant gas giant's atmosphere, smirked and touched gloves half-heartedly. The drill began. Finn kept his guard up, his footwork tight. He didn't need to look at his grandfather to know he was being watched. Malcolm's eyes were fixed on every movement. Not just Finn's. He watched Torek's stance, how he carried himself with an unbalanced weight. He observed how the cadets followed the orders but no longer seemed to trust them. He saw the subtle shift in loyalty that was beginning to crack the foundation of the training center. Torek finally broke the silence. You think standing there makes you better than me? Malcolm didn't respond. I've trained champions, Torek bragged, his voice growing louder. I built this place from the ground up. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. You built it on fear. Torek stepped closer, anger rising. You don't know me. I know enough, Malcolm replied, his voice even. Then, one of the younger cadets, no more than 13 standard years, whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. I think that's Malcolm Reynolds, the station mechanic. A wave of realization rippled through the room. Heads turned. Communication devices slipped out of pockets, not to check messages, but to discreetly record. Torek laughed, a hollow, forced sound. Malcolm Reynolds? Come on. That guy's probably just some relic from the maintenance deck. Malcolm didn't even flinch. He tilted his head slightly, then stepped forward. I don't repair relics, he said quietly. I build character. Or at least I try to. Torek's face darkened. If you're really him, prove it. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. I'm not here to prove anything to you. But if you insist on disrespecting my grandson, I'll gladly show you why you should have kept your hands to yourself. Gasps rippled through the room. A few cadets took a step back. The tone in the room had shifted entirely. It wasn't about who Malcolm was anymore. It was about what was about to happen. Torek grinned, rolling his shoulders. Fine. You want to play old man? Let's dance. Malcolm removed his cap and placed it gently on a nearby bench. He didn't stretch. Didn't posture. He simply stepped onto the mat, his stance relaxed, feet grounded, and his eyes locked on Torek with an intensity that froze the entire room. Torek bounced on his feet, raising his fists. I hope your medical insurance covers this. Malcolm didn't flinch. A beat of silence passed. Then, Torek lunged. The next 5 seconds passed so fast that most of the room didn't even register the first move. Malcolm slid past Torek's punch like cosmic dust beneath a solar sail, pivoted smoothly, and swept Torek's leg in one swift, clean turn. Torek stumbled, but before he could hit the mat, Malcolm caught his arm, twisting it into a controlled lock. Not enough to break it, but enough to end the fight. Torek's face slammed into the mat, his eyes wide with disbelief. He grunted, trying to roll over, but Malcolm released him with a casual gesture. You got lucky, Torek gasped. Malcolm stepped back, his voice calm. No. You got arrogant. The room was dead silent. A comm device slipped from the hands of one of the younger cadets, the soft clack echoing louder than anyone expected. Finn stood near the wall, his eyes fixed on his grandfather. For the first time since the previous day, his shoulders lifted, the weight on them lessened. Malcolm turned toward the room, his presence commanding yet calm. This isn't about showing off, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. It's about knowing when to stand and when to kneel. Not because someone forces you, but because you choose to honor something greater than yourself. He walked over to Torek, who was nursing his wrist, flushed with humiliation. I didn't come here to embarrass you, Malcolm said steadily. But you laid a hand on my grandson and made him feel small for telling the truth. That's not teaching. That's cowardice in an instructor's uniform. Torek said nothing. Malcolm's eyes scanned the room, locking with a few cadets who had laughed the day before. If you want to be fighters, then start by learning how to protect those who can't fight back yet. At that moment, the door opened slowly. A woman with a press badge peeked in, followed by a camera crew. Word had already spread, and a few students had tipped them off. The media drones moved in like vultures. Malcolm didn't even glance back at the cameras. He picked up his cap, dusted it off, and turned toward Finn. Come on, he said softly, we're not finished yet. Outside, a crowd had already gathered. Video clips had flooded the station, the scene spreading quickly across the station's feeds. One clip, less than 30 seconds, showed Malcolm effortlessly pinning Torek to the mat. The caption read, Old mechanic destroys combat instructor for hitting grandson. Malcolm ignored the attention, walking through the crowd as though none of it mattered. Finn followed, unsure whether to return or leave the chaos behind. Inside the training center, Torek remained near the center, nursing his wrist, trying to ignore the growing media storm outside. The cadets whispered amongst themselves. The mystery of who Malcolm really was had now been unraveled. The stillness of the station's air hung heavier now, the same kind of weight that settled before the storm broke. Malcolm moved through the training center, his steady footsteps the only sound, as reporters clustered around him like silent shadows. A young female reporter, microphone in hand, approached him as he walked past the camera crew. "Mr. Reynolds, what do you say to those who think this was just a publicity stunt?" Malcolm stopped, his gaze focused, unwavering. "The story's not about me," he said, his voice calm and sharp. "It's about what happens when people confuse power with permission." The cameraman continued filming, capturing every word. With a deliberate motion, Malcolm walked past the cameras and approached the counter at the front of the training center. There, framed on the wall, was a certificate reading, "Certified Master Instructor, Intergalactic Combat Federation." He picked it up, examined it for a moment, then turned it over and studied the back. "You forged this yourself, or did someone do it for you?" he asked loudly, making sure every eye in the room could hear him. Torok bristled, his face turning a shade paler. "That's real. I earned it," he snapped. Malcolm nodded, a quiet acknowledgement. "Then I'm sure you won't mind me calling the Federation and confirming." Torok remained silent, unwilling to engage. It was then that one of the students, a girl with dark tentacle-like hair tied neatly behind her, raised her hand. "He said we had to recruit new students, or else we'd lose our spot here. It's part of the deal." She spoke softly but firmly, voice carrying the weight of truth. Another cadet added, "I paid 500 credits last month just to keep my place." Malcolm's gaze shifted to Finn, his voice steady as he turned to his grandson. "Was that the deal with you too?" Finn nodded, his voice soft and tinged with frustration. "They said if I didn't bring someone in by the end of the week, I'd be suspended." Malcolm exhaled slowly, the injustice settling in. "Then this is bigger than a slap. This is theft, hidden under the guise of training membership." He turned to the reporter, his voice clear, without any need for dramatic flair. "You want your headline? Here it is. A man with no honor built his empire by preying on kids who thought they were learning discipline. And he used fear to keep them quiet." The room erupted in quiet whispers, the camera zooming in on Torok's face as his skin lost its color. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin everything I've built?" Torok barked, his fists clenching as he tried to hold onto the authority he thought he still commanded. Malcolm's voice was calm but unwavering. "You ruined it the moment you hit a kid for telling the truth." Torok stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to regain some ground. "Your has been. You haven't fought in years." Malcolm's eyes locked on Torok's, unflinching. "And you still couldn't last 30 seconds. Laughter rippled through the room, awkward but real, as the tension eased just a little. Torok clenched his fists, his face contorting with rage. "You want a rematch? Right now?" "Full contact," he challenged, trying to salvage some semblance of control. Malcolm shook his head, his voice as calm as ever. "There's nothing left to prove. But if you're desperate for attention, you can fight the truth. It's already outside waiting." The cameras panned to the students, and for the first time, they weren't looking at Torok. They were looking at each other, their expressions shifting. What had once been fear began to morph into doubt. One boy in the back whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "He lied about everything, didn't he?" Another student stepped forward, shaking their head. "We thought he was teaching us how to fight. Turns out he was just hiding how scared he was." Malcolm didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply walked over to the hollow board where the week's classes were listed. He picked up the stylus and erased the name Instructor Torok, replacing it with 2 simple words, "Earn honor." He placed the stylus down, standing tall, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I don't run this place. I'm not here to take it over. But what happens next is up to you. You can keep following someone who teaches with fear, or you can learn what strength really looks like." Turning to Finn, he gave a brief nod toward the door. "Let's go." As they stepped outside, the artificial sunlight hit Finn's face, making him squint. He looked back one last time through the open door to the training center, his eyes catching sight of the students. They were no longer gathering around Torok. They were gathering around each other, questioning, talking, unraveling months of blind trust. The cameras followed them, but this time, it wasn't for Malcolm. It was for the truth. The reporter chased them down once again, microphone in hand. "Mr. Reynolds, what do you say to those who think this was just a publicity stunt?" Malcolm paused beside the transport shuttle, turning to face her. His gaze was steady and unwavering. "I don't do stunts. I don't do statements. I protect my family." He opened the shuttle door for Finn, who climbed in without saying a word. As Malcolm took the controls, a young cadet ran up, holding the old elite guard patch in his hands. "Wait," the boy said, breathless. "You dropped this." Malcolm took it but then handed it to Finn. "It's not mine anymore," he said simply. The shuttle pulled away, leaving behind a training center filled with whispers, questions, and one instructor sitting in stunned silence. His empire, built on fear, was cracked beyond repair. By the time they reached their quarters, the video had spread faster than anyone expected. It had already surpassed 10,000 views. The station-wide news feeds were looping the clip, showing Malcolm's quiet takedown of Torok, his words about honor and discipline, and the moment he handed the elite guard medallion to Finn. But Malcolm didn't check his comms. He didn't care about the comments or the likes. Instead, he sat on the small balcony overlooking the hydroponics garden, watching the horizon lights shift into night mode. As Finn sat quietly beside him, the patch still clutched tightly in his hand. Inside the training center, the fallout had already begun. Parents were calling. Students were posting screenshots of their payments and private messages from Torok. Some shared videos of him yelling, humiliating them, mocking them. By the next morning, a local news drone sat outside the center, the doors locked, the windows dark. That afternoon, Malcolm returned, not to gloat or speak, but just to see. He stood across the corridor, arms folded, watching the group of teens who had gathered around the entrance. Some held bags, some had nothing, just questions. They didn't want to quit. They just didn't know what to do next. Malcolm didn't approach. He waited. From within the group, the same girl who had spoken up in the training center earlier stepped forward and crossed the corridor to stand in front of him. "We won't keep training under him," she said, her voice firm, "but we don't want to be lied to anymore." Malcolm looked her in the eye. "Then don't follow anyone who needs you to be afraid of them to feel strong." She nodded slowly, a quiet understanding in her gaze. "Will you teach us?" Malcolm hesitated, his thoughts running deep. "I'm not here to start a new training center," he said quietly. "That's not my mission." Another voice rose from the crowd. "We don't need a center. We need the truth." Malcolm turned to see a circle of students had gathered around, Leo standing among them, his eyes steady, a silent question in his stare. Malcolm remained silent, but his silence wasn't a rejection. It was contemplation. Later that night, as they sat at the kitchen table, the elite guard medallion lay between them, not a trophy, but a reminder. Finn picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. "Did you ever have to deal with people like Torok before?" Finn asked quietly. Malcolm didn't look up, but his voice was filled with the weight of experience. "More times than I can count. People who mistake fear for discipline. Loudness for leadership. Strength for violence." "What did you do?" Finn asked, his voice soft. Malcolm finally met his grandson's gaze. "I stayed standing when it mattered. And I spoke when no one else would." The communication system chimed, and Finn reached for it. But Malcolm stopped him with a raised hand. "Let it go," he said softly. "If it's important, it'll find us." The next day, a young reporter from an Interstellar news outlet arrived, unannounced. She didn't bring a crew, just a datapad and eyes filled with curiosity. She asked for 5 minutes. Malcolm gave her 10. They spoke on the balcony, the soft light filtering through the hydroponics vines. "I've interviewed warriors, admirals, athletes," she said. "But you're different." "I'm not a warrior," Malcolm replied. "I'm a witness. I've seen what happens when silence becomes complicity." She leaned forward, eyes intent. "So why step in now?" He paused, then pointed toward the garden, where Finn and 2 other students were practicing footwork on the padded deck. "Because someone finally needed me to." She watched the scene for a long moment, before asking, "Do you think the training center will recover?" Malcolm shook his head. A place built on lies doesn't need recovery. It needs rebirth. She recorded something on her datapad, then stood. "Thank you for your time," she said, offering a nod. "Don't tell my story. Tell theirs." That evening, as the station's day cycle faded into night mode, Finn sat on the balcony again. He was barefoot, his hands dusty from training, the medallion resting on his knee. Malcolm joined him, setting down a glass of water. "You think they'll come back?" Finn asked, his voice tentative. "They already have," Malcolm answered, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. In the distance, more kids arrived. Some on gravity boards, others with parents trailing behind. They carried gloves, water bottles, and most importantly, hope. One by one, they gathered quietly by the entrance to the garden, waiting, not for an instructor who yelled, but for someone who stood beside them. Malcolm rose slowly, stretching his back. "We'll need mats," he muttered. "I have some in the maintenance bay," Finn said. Malcolm nodded. "Good. But first, you lead the warm-up." "Me?" Finn blinked, taken aback. "You took the hit," Malcolm said, his voice firm yet kind. "You kept your voice. You stepped back in. That makes you a leader." Finn stood, hesitant but proud, and walked toward the others. Malcolm stayed by the balcony, arms crossed. He didn't need a title. He didn't need a spotlight. He just needed to make sure the next generation never forgot what real strength looked like. And in that quiet garden, without walls, without mirrors, without a logo, the real training had already begun. The crowd in Malcolm's garden had doubled. Word had spread effortlessly. Parents who had once sent their children to the training center now stood at the edge of the garden, quietly observing as their kids trained barefoot on the soft synthetic ground. No mirrors, no loud commands, just movement, focus, and respect. Leo led the warm-ups now. His voice was calm, his rhythm steady, different from the boy who used to sit alone in the corner. He was the one others now looked to. The elite guard medallion never left his pocket, a quiet reminder of the journey. Malcolm didn't teach every move. Sometimes he simply stood with his arms crossed, watching. Other times, he would walk between the students, offering a correction with a single gesture or a quiet word. No one was humiliated. No one was shouted at. They all listened because when Malcolm spoke, it meant something. Inside the old training center, things were unraveling fast. Instructor Torek had gone silent. A hologram announcing a temporary closure flickered on the front door, but no one believed it would ever reopen. More students came forward with stories, some from years ago, others from just weeks back. Station media picked it up again. Headlines read, "Former combat instructor under investigation for fraud, abuse allegations." News drones hovered outside the doors, reporters knocking on doors for quotes. One even knocked on Malcolm's door, but he didn't answer. Instead, the statement came from someone else. A 15-year-old boy named Zeph, who had trained with Torek for nearly 2 years. Zeph posted a video online, speaking into the camera from his quarters. His voice was steady, but there was emotion in his words. "I used to think yelling made me stronger," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I thought pain meant I was learning, but I was just afraid to speak up. Then I saw what happened with Leo, and I saw Mr. Reynolds step in. He didn't scream. He didn't punch harder. He just stood up. That's what real strength looks like." The video went viral. But this time, it wasn't about the takedown or the slap. It was about what came after. The rebuilding, the quiet moments of strength. Dozens of students reposted Zeph's message. Some added their own videos. Others posted screenshots of their payment histories or clips of Torek berating them during class. The noise was no longer in Torek's hands. It now belonged to the people he had once silenced. Back in the maintenance bay, Leo unrolled an old mat that had been gathering dust for years. It wasn't fancy, it smelled faintly of age and old hydraulic fluid. But to Leo, it was sacred ground. He tapped the edge twice before stepping onto it. One afternoon, as practice wrapped up, the same girl who had first asked Malcolm to train them approached him, holding a datapad. "We gathered some signatures," she said. "We want to turn this into something real, not just a garden thing. Maybe even rent a space." Malcolm glanced at the datapad, then at the small crowd of kids nearby, wiping sweat from their brows, laughing, helping each other clean up, training drones, and stretch bands scattered around. "Do you know why this works?" he asked her. She shrugged. "Because of you." He shook his head. "No. Because no one's trying to be the loudest voice. Everyone's just showing up for the right reason." She smiled. "So is that a yes or a no?" Malcolm took the datapad from her. "It's a maybe." The next day, a message arrived in Malcolm's inbox. It wasn't from a parent or journalist, but from an ethics investigator at the Intergalactic Combat Federation. Someone had sent them all the videos, the payment logs, and the false certificate Malcolm had turned over on camera. They wanted to open a formal case. Malcolm replied with a single sentence, "You know where to find the truth." By the end of the week, a statement from the Federation was published. Toric's license, which had already been under review, was officially revoked. His affiliation with their programs was terminated. The Federation issued a public apology to the families affected and promised to conduct audits at all affiliated training centers moving forward. The damage was done, and this time, it didn't disappear in silence. Leo stood in the garden, watching the younger kids try a new drill. One stumbled and the others helped him up. There was no mockery, no eye rolls, just quiet encouragement. Leo smiled, then turned to see his grandfather standing in the shade of the hydroponic vines. "You proud?" Leo asked. Malcolm nodded once. "Pride doesn't come from beating someone. It comes from helping others stand taller." Leo pulled the medallion from his pocket and held it out. "You sure you don't want it back?" Malcolm looked at it, then shook his head. "It belongs to whoever's carrying the weight right now. And that's not me." Later that evening, one of the parents approached Malcolm while he was packing up equipment. She had watched every session that week without saying much. "My son has never looked anyone in the eye before," she said softly. "Now he walks up and shakes hands. That started here." Malcolm didn't know what to say. He just nodded and went back to stacking mats. He hadn't come to start a movement, but somehow, one had started anyway. No banners. No grand openings. Just an old mat, a worn medallion, and the simple act of showing up every single day. A few weeks later, the garden floor had worn down in patches where feet had moved over and over again. The rhythm of training had found its own pulse. Warm-ups at station dawn, drills before midday meal, sparring just as the lights softened in the afternoon. There were no class tones, no enrollment forms, just commitment. One morning, Leo arrived earlier than usual. He laid down the mats without being asked, adjusted the training drones, and arranged the gloves in even rows. Malcolm watched from the balcony, arms crossed, a quiet smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. That day, after the final stretch and water break, the group gathered around Malcolm beneath the shade of the hydroponics tree. They didn't speak right away, they just waited. Some sat cross-legged, others leaned against bags. Leo stood in the middle, hands by his sides. Malcolm looked at them all, then reached into his pocket and held up a small item between two fingers. The Elite Guard medallion. "I used to carry this," Malcolm said, his voice steady, "not because I needed to show it off, but because it reminded me of who I had to be even when no one was watching." He paused, letting the silence settle. "Then I passed it to someone who needed it more than I did. Not because he was ready, but because he was willing." Malcolm walked over to Leo and handed him the medallion again, not with ceremony, but with certainty. "You earned it. Not for what you did in that training center, but for what you chose after. You didn't let anger decide who you'd become." Leo took it, his fingers closing slowly around the metal. The others clapped softly, honestly. No loud cheers, just shared respect. Later that evening, Malcolm and Leo sat on the balcony, watching the station lights fade. Leo noticed a glove on the mat but didn't move to grab it. "You ever think about opening a real training center?" Leo asked. Malcolm shook his head. "This is a real training center." Leo smiled. "But with a roof." Malcolm sipped his cup. "Roofs are overrated." Leo turned the medallion in his hand. "What do I do with this?" Malcolm gazed at the stars. "You carry it until someone needs it more."